Hi, I'm David Dobson. Welcome to Conversations. Today, my guest is Dr. Edward Ansha Akuffo. Edward is an associate professor of political science at the University of Fraser Valley. He obtained his PhD from the University of Alberta. His work has been published in several academic journals. He is the author of Canadian Foreign Policy in Africa, Regional Approaches to Peace, Security, and Development. It's a great pleasure to have you with me today, Edward.
Thank you very much for having me, David, and it's a pleasure to be on your program.
You are a professor of political science. What drove your interest in this field of study?
Thank you very much for that question. That's a very interesting, question. I did not actually start my educational journey, at least at a higher educational institutional, level, studying, political, science. I actually started as a business student. So I learned accounting, I learned economics, I learned, costing. And at some point, I developed interest in politics because I was interested about questions about power. I was interested in how to resolve, conflict. I was interested in why some countries are democratic, and as growing up, in Ghana, Ghana was then, ruled by an authoritarian, leader, a military, dictator. So I was interested in these kind of, questions, and that really, pushed me to study more about, politics, about how governments, work, about how decisions, are made, about how to protect human rights. These were very interesting, questions, to me. And that is why I began to study, political science.
You wrote a book about Canadian foreign policy in Africa. What inspired you to write this book?
Thank you very much. I think my interest in Canadian foreign policy questions and issues relating to Canada's relationship on the African continent goes back to when I completed my Bachelor of Arts degree at the University of Ghana in 1999. Just before I completed, in fact, that was a time I will call it, the golden age of Canadian aid to Ghana, where there was a particular, high commissioner at that time called John Schramm. I'm sure John Schramm is now, retired, and but he was such a symbol of what Canada was all about humanitarianism, about helping people and helping communities, to stand up to stand up when they have been shattered by, say, a natural, disaster. John Schramm's name was all over the place in the late 1990s. So my interest was activated as to what is this whole thing about Canada. And in fact, at that time, the now defunct Canadian International Development Agency, or CIDA, was the frontline organization that was engaged in all these implementation of all these aid projects, in Ghana. So I began to read, about CIDA, and also about the work that Canada, does, around, the world. And in fact, my interest, the more I read, the more I became more, hooked, if you will, and became more, connected to the things that Canada, was doing. So I decided to apply for a master's, program here in Canada at Brock University. I got in and continued to University of Alberta, where I did my PhD. So both at my master's education and PhD, education, I studied Canadian, Canadian foreign policy. And I continue to be a student of this exciting, field of study. So it is personal interest, but over time, this has become such an important thing, to study because of what is happening in our world. And what I believe that a study of Canadian foreign policy can help us to gain insights about what goes on, in our world.
Good story. Why did you choose to write a book that focused on Canadian foreign policy?
Thank you very much. In fact, this is linked, to the why my interest in the Canadian foreign policy in the first place. In fact, this book, Canadian Foreign Policy in Africa, Regional Approaches to Peace, Security, and Development, is the first single-authored book that has been written on the subject of Canadian foreign policy in Africa. In fact, I was, not to mince words, I was shocked to learn that for over 50 years of Canada's relations with the African, continent, because I came to Canada in 2002, or 21 years ago. After the 21 years ago that I came to Canada, there was no single authored book that has ever been written about Canadian foreign policy on the African continent. In spite of the good work that Canada was doing on the continent, whether through the foreign aid, through the work that CEDA was doing, and also peacekeeping operations through the United Nations, and other support that Canada was providing to help to build democratic governance and all that. All these activities had not excited anyone to write a single authored book, on Canada's relationship. So I was motivated to do this. And I put my shoulder on the steering wheel, and through, hard work, I was able to produce, this book. And in fact, it is ever going to be the single authored book, the first ever produced on this, subject. So my motivation was the lack of, material. In fact, what I also found out throughout my research was that most of the articles that I was reading was related to a particular country, South Africa. And some of these articles were also dated. It went back to the 1980s in the struggle against apartheid and the role that Canada was playing to trying to, to build to build economic relationship with South Africa, and also to help to develop human rights, norms in that country. So all these, motivated me to say that we need to have at least one single authored book on Canada. And I'm proud that I was able to, to work hard to achieve this. But one last little point is that if I was able to do this, it wasn't solely because of my personal, efforts. I received lots of help from my supervisor, my PhD supervisor, Professor Tom Keating, Professor Melinda Smith, and Professor David Black, who was my external PhD, external, examiner. They all, supported me in diverse, ways, and provided encouragement for me to write this. And in fact, I will be, I need to also, mention Professor Timothy Shaw, who actually facilitated or connected me to Ashgate, which is now part of, Routledge, I believe. Which published, this book. So yes, I've received lots of, support from people, but I'm glad that at least we have a single authored book. And lastly, Professor David Black has also written a single, authored book after I published, mine. And there are others that have also published, books as well. So which means that the field is now beginning to see some very exciting, academic, material.
Nice.
So this is the book.
Okay, nice. Thank you.
That is the book. Thank you very much.
What role does Canadian foreign policy have in Africa's regional organization?
One of the exciting things that Canada, did, especially at the turn of the 21st century, was a shift in focus of its foreign policy engagement. So Canada was supporting states with their development, efforts through CEDA. But at the turn of the 21st century, it became very clear that there need to be a shift in the way we think, the way we approach the African continent. Mm-hmm. Now, this coincided with the transformation of the Organization of African Unity into the African Union, mm-hmm. and the launching of exciting and important policy initiatives like the New Partnership for Africa Development. Mm-hmm. That attracted Canada. Mm-hmm. to support these regional organizations, because the African Union made democratic governance, free market, as it at the core of its engagement throughout the continent, and also its relations with the external world. These aligned with Canadian foreign policy values and Canadian foreign policy interests. And in fact, Canada was one of the countries who actually supported the African Union, through the United Nations, to help the African Union to send peacekeepers to the then conflict, which gained a lot of attention in the global space, the Darfur crisis. Between 2003 and 2005, this was the height of this violence. Canada provided military material, as well as help to organize fundraising to support the African Union mission in that country. Not only that, Canada supported sub-regional organizations like the Economic Community of West African States to implement its moratorium on small arms and light weapons. These were important initiatives that Canada supported. And in fact, as I said, it constituted a shift of Canadian foreign policy, that the Canada that was engaged in bilateral relations with states was now engaged in multilateral and bilateral relations through the United Nations and engaging with the African Union. Now, of course, at the African Union level and at the sub-regional level, like ECOWAS, it was bilateral, but it was a different kinds of bilateralism, in that this was a state dealing with regional and sub-regional organizations. In fact, that relationship has developed even further through NATO's engagement with the African Union, where Canada plays such a pivotal role, especially when it comes to NATO's airstrikes in Libya. That was led by a Canadian commander. So these relationships have developed over time, and it is an exciting new opportunity to see that Canada has finally decided to establish a permanent mission, diplomatic mission with the African Union. It is something that I think was what should have happened earlier, because of the shift in foreign policy interest on the continent. But as they say, it is better late than never. So it's quite exciting to see these things happening. Yes.
Your book proposes a non-imperial internationalist as an alternative perspective to gauge Canadian foreign policy in Africa. Can you please explain what this is and its potential?
Okay. This is a theory that I propose in the book that I wrote. Non-imperial internationalism draw on constructivism or constructivist international relations theory. It looks at the important role that ideas and identity play in constructing the policies of states. In my study of Canadian foreign policy, I came to the realization that Canada had never colonized any African state. Through the study, I also found out that Canada has such a positive image on the African continent, that the way Canada was, the perception of Canada in Africa was positive than, for example, the United States or the UK, that the United States was seen more as a belligerent power, as a power that is quick to use its might, if you will. And the UK, for example, and of course France as well, has had have had colonies, and Germany and Portugal, among others. But Canada, in spite of its engagement on the continent, has never had any colonial baggage. Then it got me thinking about how Canadian values, Canadian interests align with Canadian identity. And therefore, I developed this particular theoretical approach as a way of looking at Canada's relationship with the continent. In fact, this theory helps us to understand why Canada, for example, provide aid to African countries. And the understanding here is that it's because it wants to continue on the path of being seen as a friendly and a more caring state. But on the other hand, this theory also tells us why Canada wouldn't put so much resources on the continent, because Canada is also appear to taking advantage of how nice it is to African states, and that it becomes almost like an excuse not to intervene in African countries and do more, because it will be perceived as being colonial. So Canada is able to work both ways without necessarily being seen as being belligerent, or being seen or not seen as being belligerent, but seen as always having that friendly outlook on the continent. Yet being friendly alone does not necessarily translate into any substantive policy engagement, especially with putting resources on behind the rhetoric that we have. For example, we have Canada doesn't have a strategy towards Africa. We have never developed such a thing. It is we engage the African continent, but we don't have specific strategic document which define our role on the continent. The current government, under Prime Minister Trudeau, has made it clear that it was going to develop such a strategy. Now, in the past few weeks, we have heard that it is no longer a strategy, but rather a framework. So it tells us a story that we do not, this is a continent that see Canada as friendly, but this is also a continent that Canada doesn't seem to take seriously with any substantive, if you will, strategy towards that region. How does non-imperialism perhaps can help us to, and how does it help us to understand this? It's because Canada doesn't want to see itself in the same role as the UK or as France or the United States in the past. It doesn't want to be seen as belligerent. It wants to be seen as friendly, and that we are torn between engaging more to be perceived as belligerent, and maintaining what we are doing now to maintain our friendly relations. And that is very it's very interesting to look at how it is manifesting, if you will, in the efforts or the lack thereof of developing an African strategy.
Finally, what is your advice to students that want to study political science?
Oh dear. Political science is, I love business. I know you're a business professor. But political science is a very exciting field of study. Politics impact or affect every single thing. In the business school, in fact, without laws, companies cannot, operate. In fact, when we think about the globe, about gas prices are going up, food prices are going up, there are shortages of medication in the pharmacies. When we come to think about these things, there are not just health issues. Neither are they just business, decisions. They are political, issues. That politics does impact or affect every single thing that we do. I think the first thing that we should do is always think about politics, about how decisions are made. So political science is an exciting field of study. And I invite every single student, in fact, perhaps even my colleagues like you, to engage in political conversations. And I would love to see a lot of students taking political science classes. And we ask the question, why? In political science, our biggest question is why? Why did the government do this? How can the government solve this problem? And in all this, it's about power. And power is very, very central to the study of politics.
Thank you very much for your time, Edward. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so very much. Okay.